be careful. Put some good stuff in AI to make good stuff come out. Yeah, don't just rely on AI and its whole of a black box. It's a brilliant tool, absolutely fantastic tool, but put the human in the AI. Make sure you're producing that quality content and using your own stuff, your own sources that you know is high quality, so that you can get, instead of garbage in, garbage out, fantastic stuff in, amazing stuff out. I'm Anna Bravington, and this is SEO in 2026.
Anna, what's your number one SEO tip for 2026?
As AI becomes part of our workflow, ethical SEO means that we should be creating content that we're proud to put back into the world.
So, ethical SEO. Does ethical SEO mean human-created content?
Not necessarily. I'm a huge believer in AI for helping us do things. It's more about human influence, I think, and putting a lens on content that we have oversight of to give it checks. It's checks and balances. That's what the main thing's about. Because as clever as SEO is, sometimes it doesn't understand nuances. It sometimes doesn't understand its issues with itself. So it's understanding, making sure that we put checks and balances. And when we're looking at AI sort of output, it's really important to look at what is AI has. It picks up biases and sort of weird things as it's going along. And as humans, it's really good to have like a good spread of us as well, to understand what sort of content that it's creating and what sort of content we're creating that we're going to be putting back into that world. For example, I work a lot in disability forums. I've got ADHD, neurodivergent, my son's autistic. I'm also classed disabled. I've got fibromyalgia. I understand, when language may be like ableist or, not taken into account people with disabilities. So I put a sort of human lens onto my content that AI kind of misses. It doesn't understand these sort of nuances of humanity.
So you talk about creating content that we're proud of and proud to put back into the world. But how do you measure that from an ROI perspective? What's the real value from a commercial perspective of doing that?
Do you know, it is a really good question. And I think this is the problem. In my last one that I did with you, we talked about the financial, how to talk to CFOs about the value of SEO content. And this is the problem. A lot of these things are ethical SEO. And this is why ethics and this sort of side of things gets overlooked, particularly in people that create the AI algorithms, because ethics does not always equal profit in short-term sort of scenarios. So, for example, you can't measure it very, very quickly. What you have to do is start measuring things like sentiment, how people feel about your business. I worked at a business a few years ago and the sentiment towards them was very, very negative. And they were thought of as a big corporate. Their customer service was shocking. And people just generally disliked them. And we started doing digital PR around building the community, sort of being more ethical, sustainability. And it was really hard to measure. I'm not going to lie, but we started using things like YouGov and different ways to understand how people thought about our business, whether they thought I was, as a brand, we were ethical, whether we weren't. And then we tried to track that against our sort of growth, because it is really difficult. But if you look at all the stats, everyone says that ethical brands are, particularly the younger generation, are the ones that they look out for. And it is a value that they look out for. And if they're looking out for it, that's going to lead to more sales. So you see a lot of small brands that are very ethically aware are getting good traction because of how good they are. I think, is it Patagonia? I think it's a good example of that. People are listening and understanding. From SEO point of view, people are very aware of AI these days. There's a lot of controversy around it. So this is why we're trying to use it ethically to do good in the world. It can help you no end. It's brilliant at helping you create content, but you've got to think about that content. When you put it on your site, is it something that is actually going to benefit everyone? Is it accurate? This is the important thing. Is it accurate? Is it truthful? Is it good quality content that when eventually it gets back into the AI algorithm, when someone searches your name and come and a bit of content surfaces, are they going to see an accurate piece of content or something that sounds like a ChatGPT hallucination? Because that could be quite damaging for your business.
Okay, so those are the good words to actually aim for. Does it benefit the audience? Is it accurate? Is it true? Is it possible for AI produced content to be that? Or, if not, where precisely do humans fit in to ensure that the content does reflect those values that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it kind of fits in most stages, because there's the sort of putting content into, it's the prompting that you use. So, for example, I just recently did a talk. It was called Amplifying Inequalities, the Hidden Bias in Data. And I did a test, which was, I said, create me an image of a startup founder. And it created this image of it was a mid-20s guy, looked like a tech founder. And I asked several ChatGPT chats to create me this image, and it created me the same image across every single chat. I then asked Gemini. I then asked Copilot, and it created the same image. And then in my talk, everyone in the room put the same prompt in, create me a startup founder, and it created us the same image. This was 25 different people. Because there is an inherent bias and sort of sometimes untruths in AI, sometimes you have to be careful how we prompt. So, I could have maybe put, making sure that you give me asking it to give me a diverse range of images, or when I'm talking about text, saying, making sure that I'm including neurodivergent voices, or making sure that I'm considering different cultures. The way you prompt, if we know that there's an inherent issue with a system, it's around us as humans pushing and crafting it so that it produces something that is sort of less biased. I think it's been aware of those issues that's there. And then once you've got the content, I get content sometimes and I just have to edit it myself and just tweak. It's, there's this sort of human in the loop at every stage, the prompting, the reading, making sure that sometimes you get someone to edit it or just have a look over it so that you can get a few pairs of eyes on something. And also just the input that we give it. So it doesn't have to be specifically straight from ChatGPT. I put a lot of my own generated content into ChatGPT, so it uses that to generate stuff. So making sure, like, if you're uploading images to a chat, that they're truthful, they're accurate representation. If you're uploading content, that it's good quality content. And that way you can influence the output as well. So there's all these bits at each stage, and then afterwards, regular content audits, making sure that your stuff is reflecting the brand and its audience, getting your own data to feed into it rather than using ChatGPT to find stuff, doing surveys, etc., and feeding that back into it so that you've got a representation of your data rather than ChatGPT's or whichever system that you use. And also, I tend to do like regular searches on ChatGPT and that to see what comes up if I'm mentioned, so that I know that the information that it's picking up is accurate as well. So it's a multi-stage process, really.
And multi things to potentially unpack there from what you were sharing there as well. I mean, initially I was contemplating whether or not what you were sharing, i.e. the image generation from AI, as being, is it bias or is it simply a poor algorithm that's locked into what's happened on the majority of occasions in the past, which isn't necessarily reflective of present day in the future as well. I'm completely aware of a concept of what I call the shortening tail. Chris Anderson published a book called The Long Tail back in 2006 about limitless supply of goods and services. But nowadays, what's happening with algorithms, with Amazon saying people who bought this also bought this, Spotify, here's a playlist of what other people like to listen to as well as this. It means that there's the dumbing down of what people are exposed to, and the common majority of what existed in the past is what's served up to people nowadays as being the one and only answer, which is obviously not the one and only answer, but it's reflective of the majority, which isn't good. You need to have an AI that produces something that's reflective of different scenarios. But I guess it's highly challenging to come up with results as well that don't necessarily reflect the majority of situations. It's a tough one, isn't it? And then we're talking about content here as well, about standing out a little bit, about being human centric and being ethical in what you produce, but it's so intangible as well. I'm not sure if I'm coming up with a question here. I'm just sharing lots of different thoughts with you. How do you feel about these things?
Do you know, it's really interesting because I actually quizzed ChatGPT, and actually one of the attendees in my talk quizzed ChatGPT on why it came up with this image. And it said that's what is perceived as a startup founder, exactly the same. But when I quizzed it further, we talked about the stats, because I know very well that actually a large amount of startup founders are not in the tech industry, because it was someone in the tech industry. They're not in the tech industry. It was just a startup founder, but actually you can be a shop startup founder. A startup is just a business that starts up. And then we talked about the fact that actually I know statistically I think the average age is about 35 to 40 is a startup founder. So I knew statistically this picture did not match what actually even average was in the world. It was more of a, like you said, perceived average. Because there's this young startup founder, which is what we all perceive a startup founder to be. But actually, statistically, startup founders are older. The successful ones tend to be above 40. So it was really interesting that even it wasn't using statistics. It was using some sort of societal perception of what a startup founder would be. And
it's based upon current content on the majority of the content that exists.
Yeah. The problem is, if all of us generated an image of a startup founder and it was the same image and we put it on our blog, and then AI will then read our blog, see the images and go, oh, this is a startup founder. And we're perpetuating that myth.
Yeah, self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, because this is what we're saying is, so you've got to be really careful. You've got to think, is this actually statistically true? 'Cause I did a search on, it was doctors in the UK. And I knew very well that I think it was a third of UK doctors are from an Asian background, because I'd just done some research on doctors for a pharmaceutical client. And I did just a general Google search of what that came back. And it was very, very small representative of female doctors. And I know 50% of GPs in the UK are female now, and a very small percentage of Asian doctors. So that did not actually represent the people that we actually have in the UK. Yet ChatGPT is probably going, oh, look at these images. This is what the doctors look like. So then it's feeding it back into there. And it's this awareness. I think this is where we need industry experts. It's awareness of knowing what's right. Because if I'd have looked at that list of doctors, if I hadn't already known the stats, I would have gone, oh, it kind of looks quite a little bit diverse, so it might be right. But because I knew the details and I knew the stats, I knew that this wasn't representative. So this is why we need people to understand their industries and their customers. In Matthew Syed's book, Rebel Ideas, he calls it frame of reference, where everyone has their own frame of reference and their history. And if a doctor had looked at that list, he might have gone, oh, that doesn't represent me or my colleagues. That looks very different. But if someone's not in the medical industry, they may not have noticed. So it's important that we have people with this knowledge of what your customers look like, what your industry looks like, so that we're making sure that people are represented in not just in imagery, but in tone, in mentions in the text, etc. It's really, really important.
So what your advice is saying to me is try to steer away from using generic examples, try to steer away from creating people that don't exist, generic images of people that don't exist to represent a particular person, and use real life experts, use real life customers. And if you do that, then they're actually people that are consuming content or coming up with a thought leadership for your particular industry, and then you're feeding AI with correctness in terms of what exists out there as examples.
Exactly. I mean, I do it with my podcast. So all of my podcast recordings, I use the transcriptions and feed them into ChatGPT. So they've got real world advice from real people in my industry that sort of fills it with good quality content. And if I'm going to write a blog, I've got one sort of chat project that I use, which has all of these different stories, different advice from founders, from experts. And I use that content to produce, if I need to produce AI content, I will use that to produce my content. So I know that it's coming from a place of accuracy. I mean, Notebook LM is really good for that. Notebook LM, you can shove all of your content in and have like your own mini database, and you can then create content and get ideas from it. So you're producing something that you know is of quality, because they say like they're garbage in, garbage out. AI is a bit of a black box. You don't know what's gone in there. So, do I trust what it's putting back out to me? Possibly not. I'm really careful. And if I do use it without my own content, like quiz it, I click through to every link, I have a quick read of the article, making sure that I'm happy with this content, because from a professional reputation, I don't want my content or the company's content that I'm working for to be a poor representation of us. It's got to be good quality. Interestingly, I'm just reading Mark Schaefer's new book, which is called How AI Changes Your Customers. And he mentions that he got his first customer through AI, where someone put in the top 10 marketeers in the world and he came up. And, if someone then sort of searched some of his stuff on ChatGPT and it was poor quality, they may feel like, they don't trust him. Interestingly, from an SEO point of view, and I thought might be quite good for SEOs, the Muck Rack has analysed AI responses, and they say approximately 95% of AI responses derive from non-paid content sources. The main three are corporate blogs, owned media, journalism, and academic research. So that kind of shows you how important this content is, because actually it's directly feeding that AI responses.
Anna, what's the key takeaway from the tip you shared today?
Be careful. Put some good stuff in. Put some good stuff in AI to make good stuff come out. Don't just rely on AI and its whole of a black box. It's a brilliant tool, absolutely fantastic tool, but put the human in the AI. Make sure you're producing that quality content and using your own stuff, your own sources that is high quality, so that you can get, instead of garbage in, garbage out, fantastic stuff in, amazing stuff out.
Anna Bravington is a business advisor and founder at Creating the Curves, and also an innovation director at Oxford Innovation. Find out more over at creatingthecurve.co.uk. Anna, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2026.
Thank you.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2026, the book, over at seoin2026.com.